around a little bit. So, okay, so I'm going to talk about altered states of consciousness. And I would like to start with an example. And that's something that happened, sorry about that. So, I'd like to start with an example, and this is something that happened about 2 years ago, when on a nice Saturday morning I woke up and everything was nice and fine, but something looked a bit weird, felt a bit strange, felt a bit alien. And then I realized I couldn't actually move, which is a bit awkward. And even worse, out of the darkness, there were lots of strange hands coming to grab me and hold me. So that was really quite scary, and I kind of started to develop a little bit of panic. Well, quite a lot of panic actually. And as you do in these situations, you try to think what's happening and how can I get out of this. So I thought really, really hard. And then it suddenly came to me what was wrong. It was quite obvious. The solution was quite simply, oh, I see, I'm a Norman. So that explains it. That's all right then. And I get the impression that you're not terribly convinced of the explanation. So, you know, looking back and standing here in a reasonably awake state, I would also say, not quite sure what that is supposed to explain. You know, the evening before, I went to bed here in Edinburgh, so how do I suddenly end up in Norway? And in any case, I mean, Norway is an interesting and nice country, but it doesn't usually happen that there are hands everywhere. In any case, why should that be then all right? I mean, even if it happens in Norway, I would say. So it doesn't quite make sense. The next thought I had was, oh, this is actually quite interesting. This is a kind of lucid dreaming sleep paralysis experience. And the next thought was, oh, this is great, I have to tell Chris Fringe about it. Which, yes. And then the hands disappeared and everything was really fine. And later on I woke up properly and thought, oh well, yes, I have to tell right. So yes, and next morning I got up and the first thing was I sent an email to Chris Fringe, told him about it. For those who were here yesterday, he researches, well, is at the Animalistics Research Unit in London and researches extraordinary experiences that people have. So that was a kind of my own experience of an altered state of consciousness, and it wasn't the only one. So what are altered states of consciousness? There's a definition that's quoted quite often by Farthing, 1992, saying an altered state of consciousness may be defined as a temporary change in the overall pattern of subjective experience, such that the individual believes that his or her mental functioning is distinctly different from certain general norms for his or her normal waking state of consciousness. Now, it's a bit complex, and the bottom line is really we have, it is difficult to get a clear definition of the idea of altered states of consciousness, as obviously everybody has their own experiences, and you know, our normal consciousness is different, and we can't even compare our consciousness to that of others. But the idea here is that somehow it's a subjective experience that appears to the person quite different from what they regard as normal. So it's a bit abstract. What does that mean in practice? There are lots of different ways of induce altered states of consciousness. So here's a little bit of a summary. I hope you can read it in the back. It's taken from a review article. And you can classify these experiences in a number of different classes. Spontaneously occurring, that's, for example, well, states of drowsiness, daydreaming, hypnagogic states, I'll say more about that later. Sleep and dreaming, near-death experiences. So my experience in Norway would fall into the spontaneously occurring category. Then there are physically or physiologically induced experiences. For example, you can experience altered states of consciousness in extreme environmental condition, or when you starve or are on a strong diet, sexual activity and orgasm, and with breathing techniques. Then there are psychologically induced altered states of consciousness. Things like relaxation methods, meditation, hypnosis, biofeedback, but also sensory deprivation. And these classes here are also quite relevant, disease-induced. So, for example, psychotic disorders, schizophrenia, brain damage, stroke, things like that, and also taking drugs. For this review article and for my talk, I'm not so very much interested in drugs, because I think the psychologically induced things tell us much more and are much more interesting. So there's quite a lot of different possibilities. Can I have a quick show of hand? Who has experienced one or some of these? Almost everybody. Okay, yes.
What is biofeedback? Sorry.
Oh, biofeedback is a technique, sort of, well, how to describe that? It's an electronic device that measures your brain waves, and you get some kind of indication what your brain waves are, and you learn how to control it through that way. So it's a kind of technologically, well, a kind of meditation with technological aid. So, okay. So these are quite a lot of different methods to induce altered states of consciousness. And what are the experiences typically? So there's a little bit of phenomenology. You get sensory changes, hallucinations, synesthesia. So in my case, these hands, I don't think they were actually there in the room, so it must have been a hallucination. Time perception changes quite a lot. And I found that actually when I tried to write that email to Chris on the next day, because it was really difficult to work out what happened first and what happened then. Because you may have experienced that in dreams when you try to tell somebody, but it's difficult to get it into some kind of order. It all happens at the same time, and you have a feeling of timelessness. Your thinking is changed, can be faster or slower. You lose concentration. Meaning, that's an interesting thing. Familiar things seem alien. In my case, I was in my normal bedroom, but it seemed strange. And evidence, things have different significance. Like I said, the fact that I'm in Norway, I would not normally accept accept as an explanation for weird, but it seemed really quite convincing at that time. And you may have, when I studied physics, sometimes you work hard on a math problem, and then you sort of doze off a bit while you're working, and it suddenly becomes quite clear and obvious and easy and so on. You don't quite know why it is easy and what the solution is. So when you wake up again, you can't remember, you just remember that you've solved it somehow. So something, the kind of what you expect is evidence and what you find significance changes. Control, you don't have as much control about yourself, and often you lose your sense of agency. Sense of agency is the feeling that I am responsible and the actor of my own actions. So normally I feel that when I move my hand, that's me who's doing that. But in dreams or altered states of consciousness, you can get the feeling that it's difficult to describe because it's really very alien to our normal everyday experience. But you can feel it seems to you that something else is controlling you in some way. So in psychotic disorders, schizophrenia, the kind of typical thing what people say is there was a voice in my head controlling you and so on. So it's kind of, you don't necessarily feel that you are the actor of your own actions, the agent of your own actions. Body map changes, you may have out-of-body experience, you feel that your body isn't your own and things like that. And the last thing is, sorry that got messed up a bit, emotions can be, or are usually highly intense, can range from panic to happiness, and vary quite a lot. Like in my case, it's really a lot of panic when these hands came, but then when I had the great explanation for it, I was extremely happy about it. So it was very, very extreme. And so this was a bit unsystematic, so there have been attempts to make the phenomenology a bit more systematic. One of the earliest events, the earliest attempt, was by Dietrich in 1985, who asked lots of different people under hypnosis, well, after hypnosis and meditation, but also drug users and so on. And he classified 3 kinds of experience, and the words are really quite weird. That's how he called it. So oceanic self-unboundedness is the feeling that you are one with everything, and the universe and you are somehow connected, and there isn't really a difference and so on. Then, not very nice, is fearful self-dissolution. You have the incredible panic that yourself dissolves and disappears. That's particularly with drug use, the kind of bad trip where you just feel that you're disappearing somehow and that you can't handle it. And the third factor is the visionary restructuring of reality. Ott looked at meditation in particular and found similar things, mystical experience, so that's a bit like the oceanic self-unboundedness, a nirvana dimension, and the deep feeling of relaxation. The interesting thing is that for meditation and hypnosis and so on, there was never this kind of fearful self-dissolution, rather more positive experiences. So, what's happening? in the brain there. So as I'm not sure everybody knows much about the brain, I brought a brain here. Well, I brought one in here, but I also have a spare one. So plastic brain. It's my plastic brain, replacement brain. Bought it on the internet as a spare, but then, like many things you buy, it doesn't actually work. But it's useful to show, for showing people where things are in the brain. So I'm running out of hands now. Right, so generally the brain has a lot of different parts, and different functions are, well, placed or centered in different areas of the brain. For example, when you see something, so let me see, I have to move over there. So that is just like my normal brain now. So here's the spinal cord coming in, and your eyes are somewhere here. So when you see something, then awkwardly the visual input actually goes to the very back of the brain rather than the front. So whoever designed that was a bit inefficient, really. But yes, so visual processing happens in the back here, and then there are different pathways how. So the primary visual cortex is somewhere here. That's where the immediate input is processed. But then there are different ways. For example, if somebody throws something at me, then I would perhaps catch it or duck or something. And some of that is produced, is processed along the back here. That's the so-called wear pathway. So the movement of things is processed along that path and kind of ends up in the motor cortex here, so that's in the middle. There's also a different path analyzing what you actually see, that's a ball or whatever. So that goes here along the ventral bottom part of the brain, and the wear pathway doesn't necessarily become conscious. So when somebody throws something at me, then I can just catch it before I even become aware, or duck away before it even goes into my consciousness. So some kinds of processing happen consciously, others unconscious. And so that's just an example how an input is split up into different parts, and what you see is processed in a different area from where you see it. Most relevant for our purpose is the frontal part, where a lot of the what's called higher functions are really located: reasoning, planning, organization. This is a bit simplified. I took it from the American Psychological Association, but this location, that doesn't mean that your personality just sits in there. The brain, as I tried to explain with seeing something, the brain actually, the different areas work together. But these parts are strongly involved in certain tasks. So, for example, if there was a famous case in the 19th century where a worker got some kind of tool right through this part here, and his personality changed completely. Or when you have a stroke around that area, then you're paralyzed and that kind of thing. So it's distributed, but also very much connected. And that's really what leads to the general theory of the kind of mainstream theory of altered states of consciousness. That all these different factors that we looked at, psychological effects, sensory deprivation, things like that, all act on different parts of, well, different aspects of the brain. For example, this is apnea of oxygen. Too little oxygen, so that changes the chemistry of the brain. Reduced vigilance changes arousal, and a bit dangerous here. Right, so, and this leads to the concept of disconnectivity. So, in normal functioning, in our normal awake state, the different areas of the brain cooperate, and that gives you your conscious experience. The one good theory about what's happening in the brain in altered states of consciousness is that the connections between the different areas become weaker. And then functional areas work with more noise and work independently. So your visual cortex here doesn't get much input when you're sleeping. So it tends to try to make sense of whatever activity is, and you may get hallucinations. On the other hand, the areas that are relevant for emotions, which are somewhere in the middle there, amygdala, they don't actually get so much information from the others, so they may take what little signals there come to them, and think, well, this is really exciting, so I have to create large emotions simply. But these different aspects of your experience don't necessarily fit together in the same way. So you get for example, you get very strong emotions even if there is no reason to have them. Or you get the feeling of understanding something, the kind of reward that you've understood something really great, even though you actually haven't, just because parts of your brain become active as they don't have strong input from others, from other areas. A related aspect, and this is something you can also see from brain scans, for example, the transient hypofrontality hypothesis. The frontal lobe, as I mentioned before, is connected to a lot of the so-called higher functions, personality, planning, and so on. And there's evidence that these areas are particularly inhibited. So that means that, well, in normal functioning, they also control and inhibit other parts of the brain, control what kind of memories should come up and so on. So if this executive control is weaker, then a lot the other areas can do a lot of things on their own. So you get things like timelessness, reduced thinking and planning. Oh, and I kind of forgot to mention that really. This is particularly the case in meditation and hypnosis. Now, generally how meditation works is that you concentrate really, really strongly on some small things. For example, the flame of a candle or something. And whenever your concentration, when your attention moves away from that, you try to bring it back. And with a lot of practice, you focus very much on this single stimulus. And that has the effect that some areas of the frontal lobes are highly activated, but also other surrounding areas can be suppressed. So the theory behind that is essentially your brain kind of dissolves into a number of independent functional units, and different parts of your consciousness, what you in normal states of consciousness, what you experience as whole, where emotions and sensory input and so on all fit together, they become a bit independent and don't quite fit together as they normally do. And that gives you these weird feelings. Right, what comes next? Yes, after that little bit theoretical bit, just want to go through a number of examples perhaps. Sleep paralysis, that's my experience again. It's quite common, and we have an expert on this here. Oh, unfortunately, so this means French and Santa Mauro as a review article. So I don't want to say too much about this now, but it's an experience that people have at sleep onset, when you're falling asleep or when you're waking up, and you feel awake. It's not like a dream. It has more the quality of being awake, but also you're unable to move or speak, and you may get vivid hallucinations, which are then called hypnagogic or hypnopompic hallucinations, depending on whether they happen before or after sleep, and I always mix them up. So it's a very common experience. So depending on which study you look at and how people were asked, you get results between 20 and 60% of the population has experienced that at some point. And again, I think most of the kind of hallucinations and weird experience can be explained by general disconnectivity. The interesting thing that comes here in addition is the paralysis, that you're unable to move. And that actually makes sense. My brain again. Normally, when you're asleep, then there are little bits here in the brainstem somewhere that disconnect your body from your brain. It's quite useful, because otherwise you would just act out all your dreams and it would be quite a disaster. So, sleepwalking is the kind of situation when that doesn't work, and when you actually do move during your sleep. But normally it's switched off, and when you wake up, then your body should come back online again. But sometimes that isn't quite synchronized, so your brain starts to wake up, and you get this feeling of being really awake, but the connection still isn't there. So you feel that you can't move, and of course somehow your brain has to make sense of that, and that's partly where these hallucinations may come from, sort of your brain trying to work out what's happening and find an explanation why you can't move. I should have mentioned something earlier when I explained visual perception. It's not actually quite that easy that the visual input comes in here and then moves forward and so on and determines what you see. It also goes the other way around, that what you expect to see and what you want to see and what your attention is on determines what you really see. If you think back to yesterday, for those who were here, the film with the gorilla walking through, most people don't notice the gorilla when they're focusing on something else. Or, for those who haven't seen the film, another example, it's not allowed to use a mobile phone when you're driving. And the reason is that when the mobile phone rings and it takes your attention, then you may actually become blind to other things that are happening around you. That's, of course, in traffic isn't very good. So there are effects that your expectations and your central executive functions actually determine what you see. It's not just that you perceive the world and that's then processed, it also goes the other way around. So when you experience something that you're unable to move, then your brain may well try to make sense of that by seeing aliens or something that's holding you. Another example, hypnosis. I don't really want to say much about that. But that's hypnosis is good for reducing pain or for relaxation, but bad for retrieving memories. I mention that because you sometimes get that reports that police used hypnosis on witnesses to get out memories that they had forgotten and so on. And you do get stories that come up in hypnosis, but the problem is it's very difficult to know whether they are real memories or false memories. Because, in many of these altered states of consciousness, you're sent back to hypofrontality. Your central executive, your control that actually inhibits wrong information is reduced, and so you can get spurious, false memories essentially. So hypnosis isn't very good for that. And stage hypnosis is a completely different matter, which I'd like to skip over here. Another example, I put this in because this morning when I got up, I went to my, picked up a t-shirt, and it just happened to be the one of a shamanic drum that I bought in Finland. So this is actually the same image as that one here. I spent a lot of time in Finland related to my research, and it's the people in northern Finland, Norway, northern Russia, the Sami, they still have a shamanic tradition. So these are quite old drawings from the 17th century, and typically a shaman, one of the important implements he has is a drum. But to get into a shamanic trance is a complex thing. So it's not like perhaps many people think that they just take a few drugs and then get high on that. But it's a long, can involve starvation, diet, not drinking much. The drum, rhythmic music can also induce a trance. This is something that the group around, I think it was also Ott. Anyway, so they found that rhythmic drumming with something a bit like 1 beat per minute per second can induce trance. But interestingly, that's also a kind of rhythm that's quite often heard in pop music. So, and it's probably some kind of that it helps to. It's a rhythmic impact that helps to synchronize brainwaves in some way, but it's not, as far as I know, it's not really well researched what's going on there. But drumming seems to have an impact. And then when you are in a trance, so this guy here is actually in some kind of dream world. And what the shamans in Finland and Sapmi in Lapland did was then record their findings from the other world on their drums. So you get the world of the living here in the middle and the underworld below that, and the heavenly sphere above that. And there are gaps in between, so you can actually move between them. And there are different beings that you can meet and so on. So it seems to have been something that people did, well, as soon as we became human, probably. So goes back to prehistoric rock art. One person who researched that quite a lot is David Lewis Williams. And this here, he thinks, shows people dancing, because the posture they have is very similar to modern day shamanic dances in that area in South Africa. Other rock carvings can be related to the kind of hallucinations that you get that are produced right in the visual cortex. For example, in diabetes, you can also see this kind of, or in epilepsy, you can see these kind of patterns. So some of them can be found in rock art as well. And another good argument is that many rock art places where there is rock art are so deep and inaccessible that they doesn't make sense to see them as art that was meant to be seen. It's more likely that somebody went really, really deep underground into a cave and spent time there and used that to connect to spirits or whatever. This is, of course, all quite speculative, like many things in archaeology, when it's not about the actual artifacts. Interpreting what people thought several thousand years ago is always a bit tricky, but it does seem convincing that altered states of consciousness was something quite common. Quickly about mystical experiences. You may have seen this helmet here, the God helmet. Michael Persinger did some research where people had to wear this helmet, and there are magnets in there, create magnetic field, and he says they induced religious experiences, so people had visions of God and things like that. Problem is, somebody tried to replicate that and it didn't quite work. People did have visions in that study, but they did have visions even when there were no magnetic fields applied. So it's probably just placebo. It's not quite clear. There's been a heated exchange between these people, how to interpret that. So I don't really want to take any sides on that, but it's difficult to see how that fits in. It's quite possible with magnetic fields you can influence the brain, so it's quite possible, and you get some of the effects that you have from other influences on the brain, but how this really fits in is a bit difficult to see at the moment. few minutes about near-death experiences. Yes, death is, I think, for most people quite a significant point in life. I'm really quite interested in that. And when you read the popular literature, Raymond Moody, for example, you get a kind of standard model of near-death experiences. You probably all have heard something like that. That when you die, you have an out-of-body experience. You feel you leave your body, then there is a long tunnel, light at the end, warmth, calmness, you're happy, and there are beings waiting there for you, relatives, friends, religious figures, who help you pass over. It's really quite nice. And there are cases where these experiences happened during brain death. Pam Reynolds is an example. She had a brain operation. So she was actually, her brain was deactivated, and then she reported something later and so on. So does that show there's something happening after death? Indication of the afterlife? Problem is, it doesn't quite work like that. If you look at the evidence as a whole, there are lots of reports that don't fit into the standard model. So Hubert Knoblauch reports things like, I think Indian people don't go through a tunnel, they ride into heaven on a cow or something like that. So it's completely different, doesn't fit into that model. So that's kind of, and an empirical study with 2,000 participants, I missed out that word, showed that quite a lot of them didn't think it was a really nice experience. They felt terrible terror. For some reason, East Germans were terrorized by death, West Germans weren't. So there's probably some kind of cultural impact. That study was done in, I think, 99, probably 97, so a few years after unification still. And these reports go back when Germany was still divided. And best cases like Reynolds are just, I looked at, it's not very convincing. So don't want to go into near-death experiences too much, as we're coming to an end. So just to revisit that, so I tried to explain that in the brain there are transient changes, and the most important ones are probably disconnectivity, that different parts of the brain don't cooperate in the same way as they normally do, and that the central planning is reduced, hypofrontality. I think, as we saw at the beginning, these states are very common. Almost everybody had something like that. And they've been with us ever since we became human. So can we make anything of that? Now, one thing is the kind of report. Yes, so really exciting. I mean, everybody likes the Matrix and the special effects, but that's nothing against kind of effects you get in your dreams. So, and you're actually part of the action. Something that I didn't quite mention, altered states of consciousness can have a positive effect. They may have to do with creativity. There are reports that people found a solution in dreams they actually remembered afterwards. Probably again because a lot of inhibition that stops your creative processes can also be reduced. They help us to understand how the brain works. And very interesting, in my opinion, is that all these states are quite irrational. Taking the fact that being in Norway, as an explanation for something weird happening. This is, I mean, I would think that's quite irrational. But this does help us to understand irrationality and rationality. And I think being here with mostly skeptics, and as a skeptic myself and scientist, I think we're always a bit in a danger that we see rationality as something, well, we value that very highly, and we feel that we are very rational and other people are irrational. These altered states of consciousness, now I'm provocative here, these altered states of consciousness tell us that we all can be quite irrational. Obviously, in extreme cases like the experience I showed, that's really weird, but you may have seen that, you know, when you're tired, that you don't quite think in the same way, and that you do sometimes think things that, you know, when you feel better, you think, well, I was really a bit of a jerk then. So I think it's a bit of a reminder that they teach us to be critical of our own irrationality and be more tolerant of the irrationality of others, because being critical of others and tolerant to yourself, that's something everybody does anyway. So perhaps we need a bit of push in the other direction. Thank you.